his destiny, and he's just walking in everything. Bottom line, he's walking in everything that he was created for, and he's walking in everything he was to be, and he's walking in this unbroken and unhindered fellowship with God. That's called Eden, right? Which means pleasure. And so we find, if you look, go ahead and look there. We're at the very end of chapter 2. We get to the end of chapter 2, and we see this summary statement of man walking in his destiny, all he was created for. Here's the summary statement, and it's kind of shocking in a way. It says, the man and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. That's an interesting summary statement to me. Is that interesting to anybody else, or is that just me? Am I just being kind of junior high about it? Is that what it is? Maybe I'm a little junior high, and it's a little junior high, maybe your initial thought, but think of it a little deeper. Imagine what it would be like if, and not just physical nakedness, but imagine what it would be like psychologically to be totally available, totally transparent, even totally vulnerable with no fear. Think of it. Nothing in your life that you're ashamed of. That's a pretty incredible thought, really, when you look at it a little deeper. But then, as we saw last week, we concentrated on chapter 3, verse 1 through 6. We saw that this process of the fall. Do you remember anybody that was here, remember the 5 Ds? I'll give special bonus points for anyone, extra jewels in the crown. Doubt, okay, doubt. What was the next one? Yeah, doubt, which leads to distortion of truth, which leads to desire, which leads to disaster, right? And so that's what we were seeing last week, and that's obviously what happened in this disaster we read about in verse 7, and that's where we're going to kind of focus on and concentrate a little bit tonight. She gave some to her husband who was also with her, and she ate it, there in verse 6. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized that they were naked. See, exactly the contrast to chapter 2, verse 25. And they sewed fig leaves together, and they made coverings for themselves. I think this verse tells almost the entire story of mankind. Shame enters the picture. Here, you're seeing it. First we see in verse 7, their eyes were opened. For the first time, there is self-realization, maybe even self-absorption. For the first time, self-awareness even enters the picture. Isn't that weird? And because of this, we see that the second part here, that they realized that they were naked. And so this self-awareness, it brings shame. And then, because of this shame, because of that nakedness, it says in verse 7, they realized, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. They went about their own efforts to try to cover their shame. Do you not think that's the story of mankind? I think that's a pretty concise and pretty condensed version, but of the whole story. This self-awareness, which brings about shame, which causes them to then, in their own efforts, try to cover it. And so what I want us to do tonight, this is a little different than what I might normally preach, but it's just kind of right here in the text, and as I was working through it, I just couldn't get around it. And so I want us to kind of drill down into that process in verse 7. And if it's no good, you can tell me afterwards, Dave, that's no good, never talk like that again. To which I'll totally ignore, but you can speak what you think, right? So we're going to drill down to that, verse 7. Shame has entered the picture. You've seen it. You've experienced it, right? Shame enters the picture. They are, let's try to paint the picture. They're confused. Maybe their face is flushed. They're confused. Their eyes are cast downward. Their head is lowered. Maybe their posture is a little slack. shame has entered the picture. The question is, I think, or at least the first initial question is, what is shame? And I'm not sure that the church has done a really good job of articulating this. In fact, in some circles, I hear shame is almost, shame, which you could argue is the precursor to salvation, is almost, it's almost just been eradicated. There's no shame. Even like church circles. It's kind of weird. See, I told you it's a little different than I usually preach, but it's here. So what is shame? I went about trying to find a definition for the word shame, trying to put some words on it, and hopefully it would define it, because the definition of it is important, because it then begins to speak to how it is we get rid of it and how we deal with it, right? And so I went to several different places, and here's the essence of what I saw. Quote, shame is a painful social emotion resulting from the comparison of one's actions to one's standards. Now, at first blush, that's like, okay. But I want to tell you, that may be the best that humanism has to offer, but it falls extremely short of what real shame is. Genesis 3:3. You must not eat. Where am I? Yeah, you must not eat from that tree that's in the middle of the garden. You must not touch it, or you will die. Well, we know she added the touch it part, but there was this standard that God set that said you don't eat from that tree in the garden. We saw it back in Genesis 2, I think 18 or something like that. We saw it. There was a standard. He said, don't eat this fruit. Well, then in Genesis 6, when the woman saw the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and she ate it. Listen, guys, it wasn't her standard that had been broken. It was God's standard that had been broken. And so then it is the breaking of his standard, not our standards, the breaking of his standards that begin to bring shame. Does that make sense? And that begins to help us understand why that humanistic definition of shame really just it falls way short, doesn't grab it. Shame comes from the comparison of our actions to his standards, not my standards, his standards. And as I say, this is important because the definition speaks to how shame is removed and how it's resolved. I don't want to get too ethereal, and I read a lot about this. I don't want to get too ethereal or too far off on some kind of pop psychology in it, but let me try to make an application, because you can find a lot of books out there. I saw a bunch of them online this week. I didn't bother to buy any because what is the online deal, man? Does anybody buy books anymore? Because you can kind of get most of it for free, really. Anyway, I saw lots of it, and they're books of this kind of self-help variety. They were probably pretty humanistic in their orientation. They're written these days, but they're written with the improper definition of shame in mind. And they would argue that to rid yourself of shame, simply change your standards. Giggle, giggle. It's true, right? Just change the standard, and shame will disappear. Or they would say, hey, you know what? Shame, it's just a result of culture, right? Because culture is really the one really the force that is determining for us what is right and what is wrong. Culture is informing us as to what our standards are. So culture has imposed on you this standard of conduct, and so what's necessary then is the change of culture so that we are free to change our standards, and voila, there's no guilt, there's no shame. You've probably seen how that's played out. I'm going to say some things here, and I want you to understand I am not talking from a political perspective. I got some opinions. You got some opinions. I bet I think my opinions are right, or otherwise I wouldn't hold them, right? And I'm sure that you think your opinions are right, and I'll give that to you. And I think there's a great place for discourse politically, even in the body. Wouldn't that be amazing? The church could talk about politics and not split and divide. That would be incredible. But at this point, I'm not really talking about politics. I'm really trying to look at this from a more spiritual and from a biblical perspective. Here's the deal, guys. What side of all this you're on, there is an active effort these days to change culture. And as I say, I'm not speaking this politically, but from a spiritual perspective, I want to tell you, the effort to change culture at its root is an attempt to remove shame. It's an attempt to change the standards by which we might judge ourselves. And I'll tell you, man, again, just non-politically, you don't have to be a prophet to see it. The attempt to move from his standard in sex and in gender and in marriage may change laws and it may change cultural attitudes, but it will not remove shame. Now, I can say that from a spiritual perspective because my objective in life is not to change laws. My objective in life is to tell people the good news so that they can be rid of their shame. Right? Well, there will always, let me underline always, and it's awful. There will always be shame associated with premarital, postmarital, and homosexual sex. It'll always be there because his standard has not changed. And the changing of a law or even the changing of cultural norms don't change his standard. And so because the violation is in his unchanging standards, it will always produce shame. Is this making any sense? It won't ease the shame. In fact, I think that really what happens is the change in culture and the change in, see if you can follow me on this, the change in culture and the change in laws and all that around it, and I'm not debating the laws, I'm talking about something deeper than that, but the change in all that really, it just results in more militaristic behavior and increasingly more and more and more bizarre behavior. And if you don't believe me, go to Sweden. If you don't believe me, go spend 3 days in the heart of Amsterdam. If you don't believe me, go take a grand tour of most of continental Europe. And you're going to find places where the laws have changed, cultural attitudes have changed, and people are covered with shame. And their behavior becomes more and more something. And their behavior becomes more and more bizarre. That's why the definition of shame is so important, because the cure is not found in us changing our standard. I'll come back to the text, I promise. But think of it, shame. Can I tell you that what I read, psychology makes a pretty important distinction that I've not heard this distinction so much in the church, and I think they add something here. Psychology indicates, I read two types of shame. One, an objective shame. In our vernacular, objective shame that results from violation of his statutes or his standards, and then a subjective shame. Subjective shame is shame that is imposed on you, not because of your own actions, but probably because of something that was done to you that was out of your control. I think that here in the West, in the church even, I think shame is a big issue for us. And for some of us, that is shame because our behavior has fallen short of his standards and we haven't applied the remedy, or in some cases, there's shame because of what's been done to us. In either case, it's very painful. And I think we all deal with this. That's why I kind of focused here. Because I think we all deal with this at one level or another. It's damaging. I want you to think about it just a second. I'm promising to come back to the text, but think about this a second. Shame. There's probably nothing more damaging to self and to a sense of identity than shame. I would want to argue that shame is primary. One of the primary things that becomes an impediment to us in really gaining and feeling and understanding some sense of belonging. And even deeper than that, even allowing us to feel to have some type of shared intimacy. I got to tell you guys something like, I'm trying to say how to phrase this the best. I've done a lot of, not a lot, but I've done a fair amount. I'm old. How many of you guys know I'm old? Yeah, 1, 2, 3, think. How many of you guys think I'm young? Extra stars in your crown? Thank you. Yeah. I'm young, but I am old enough to have done quite a bit of like marriage counseling, and we had a pre-marriage counseling thing we did yesterday. I mean, we're into that a lot. I want to tell you that as I have been involved, and Bobby, I'm not a professional, but I'm just doing my best. And when I get in trouble, I'm going to send them to you, okay? But I'm just doing my best. And so I'll tell you, though, Bobby, as I've gotten into it, the longer I'm in it, the more and more what I see is that when I'm talking to someone where there is an issue with respect to intimacy in their marriage, or where there is an issue with respect, they just can't identify who they are or what group they belong to, I want to tell you that what I'm beginning to see and understand is that often at the root of that, maybe not always, but often at the root of that is shame. Right? So it's a big deal. I'm going to give you one more. Stay with me on this part. I'm going to get back to the text, and it's all going to make sense. It's going to be incredible. And if it's not, just don't tell me. But here's an interesting one. How about the relationship of shame to narcissism? You got to think on that. Bob, I saw you roll your eyes. Bob, you're thinking on that a little bit. Here's what I'm saying. I would suggest that the root of many ills in the West is some level of narcissistic behavior. Stay with me. Don't let me lose you. Here's what I'm saying. A primary feature of narcissism is the interpretation of reality solely or primarily in relationship to ourselves. It's narcissistic, right? So let me give just an easy example of that. So a husband is off and he's on a trip, he's on a business trip, and he comes home on a Wednesday and he says to his wife, she says, "How was the trip?" And he's like, "Oh, it was awesome, man. I made the sale I needed to make. It was great. And by the way, Los Angeles is a great city, and I was staying at this really cool hotel, and it's fun. And there was this place there, this bakery, buddy. They were the best sweet rolls I had ever had." And his wife's response is, "What? You don't like my cooking?" Do you understand what I'm saying? It's not what it was about. See, she has, in that sense, then, that I'm not saying she's narcissistic or it's narcissism, but that's narcissistic, right? She has interpreted a reality totally in relation to only herself. I want to tell you that we do that a lot. here we are in America, even in the church, and frankly, it's all about me. See, reality, interpreted on the basis of what's important to me. So it can be very subtle, but narcissistic, none the same. Okay, enough pop psychology. You guys following the logic? Because now I'm going to put the text, it's going to make sense for you, I think. All right, look at Genesis 3:7. We read it a minute ago. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and many realized that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together, and they made covering for themselves. They sewed fig leaves together. Their eyes were open. You see, shame brought about not only hiding, but a whole new way to interpret reality. Shame brought about a way to interpret reality that has a focus on it in relation to themselves. Are you getting that? It's all like right here in Genesis. It's crazy. Like I read, books and all, and it's all just right here in one verse. Prior to this, they were not even self-aware, much less self-absorbed. So how could they begin then to interpret reality just in relation to themselves? Shame is, the impact is broad, and the impact is deep. There's a verse in Daniel, it's interesting, I thought. It says it's a reference to eternal punishment, really. And it says, some are resurrected to everlasting life, and some are resurrected to everlasting shame. Do you see the picture of hell? The picture of hell is a place that is void of God, right? Some are resurrected to everlasting shame, the constant exposure of sin without remedy. Like, that's hell, man. I think we need to be honest enough to recognize when we see radical movements on TV, or we see, no matter what the attempt is to cover the shame, I think we need to be honest enough to recognize that there are people around us, people we know, who live in hell because their sin is constantly exposed to them, and they live in that constant exposure without possibility of a remedy. And so when we come to recognize that, maybe our response would be less political and much more kingdom-oriented. Making any sense at all? Because you know what? There is a remedy. There's a remedy, and God, we'll see here in chapter 3, there's a remedy. There's a remedy for people we love and people we know. There's a remedy for you, and there's a remedy for me, because we know that God, He doesn't leave them there. The first thing we see is this. The first thing we're going to see here in terms of His response to all this, and the first step in the remedy, is the love of a Father who searches them out. Check out, Jesus talked about that, right? I think He told a little parable about that. And we're seeing it right here, verse 8 and 9. Then they're hiding, right? These guys are hiding, man. They got the fig leaves on, and they're tucked in behind some trees, thinking they're going to hide. But then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as He was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And they hid from Him among the trees of the garden. That's kind of smart, right? If you got leaves on and you hide in the trees, certainly He's not going to see you there. But the Lord God called to the man, and He says, where are you? He knew, of course, exactly where they were. And so what we're seeing here is, and this first step in us understanding the remedy to the shame that we experience, whether it's direct shame or whether it's indirect or subjective, but the first remedy here is to understand like the perfect love of a Father. This is what He's conveying to them. He comes and He seeks them out. He's leaving the 99 Jesus talked about to find the one. Have you ever experienced that? Can I tell you that there have been, you're probably going to be shocked to know that the preacher has also fallen short of the glory of God. Does that shock you? Yeah, you know me pretty well, I guess. Can I be honest enough to tell you, though, that at times in my life when I was running the fastest and trying to get as far away as I could, those are the times he chased me all the more. Right? You've experienced that, right? This is the perfect that's love, man, the perfect love of a father. So when we come to think about shame and all of the negative ramifications of that in our life, first recognize the love of a father who reaches out to you in your very worst moments. Man, I can think of some moments where, well, I guess just suffice to say, I can think of some moments where he really shouldn't have reached out to me. But see, the perfect love of a father reaches out to us in those in our worst moments. And this step is really important for us to understand the perfect love of a father, because it's that offers kind of a reorientation and an understanding of who he is and what he is that will, without that revelation, it will be pretty difficult then to apply the next step. And I'm really convinced that I probably don't need to stand up in very many forums here in Roanoke and shout enough to convince people of their sin. I am pretty sure that by and large, at some level, they are already aware of that. And not only are they aware of that, they're aware even of maybe the impact in their lives. I don't have to stand up and shout that. What I do need to stand up and shout, first of all, is, and it's not the total message, but first of all, is to help them understand you have a father who loves you unconditionally and who will search you out among the masses because you are that important to him. That's where it starts, at least. It doesn't finish there, but that's where it starts. And my proposition here today is it's pretty difficult to apply the second step of the remedy if we haven't been able to communicate that one. Well, here's the second step. We'll see it in the text, but basically what we're saying is, second step, stop trying to cover the shame yourself. And trust him to cover it. I don't know if I can put this in the right words, but I read something that was talking about when Adam and Eve, remember they sewed these leaves together, and shame's entered the picture, and they're hiding and they're trying to cover themselves and cover that shame. And it's like all of mankind from that point on, because now of this self-awareness, is predisposed to spending a lot of time figuring out what leaves to wear. Does that make sense? Step 2, stop trying to cover the shame yourself and trust him to cover it. That's why I say step 1's important, because how do I trust him to cover it if I haven't been reoriented and have some truth and some revelation around who he is, right? And so now I get that, though. Stop trying to cover it and trust him to cover it. Look at verse 7. We keep reading that, but there it is. The eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked, so they sewed the fig leaves together, and they made coverings for themselves. They're trying to cover it. It won't work. This from the wisest man of all time. He who covers his sin will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them finds mercy. I like that. That's out of Proverbs. It's right here. Look at verse 21. God's response. So the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and for his wife, and he clothed them. Do you see? Do you see the intimacy in that? Like, so they blow it. Now shame's entered the picture. Now this focus on self and the whole new way of interpreting reality that's basically narcissistic. Now they're in all of this quagmire. He goes and searches them out and is walking through the garden in the cool of the day, sewing them a new outfit. Is that crazy to you? He sews them this outfit, these skins. He sews them together, and I don't have time to. But basically, we're seeing this picture of and a foreshadowing of Jesus covering our sin, covering our shame. Right? Making sense? So it's step 2 is like when he covers us. Check this out. It's his righteousness covering us. It's his righteousness covering. This is crazy to me. It's his righteousness covering the ugliness of our shame. And so for those who'll trust him, those who'll put on the cover that he provides, and that is a choice we make. For those who trust him, put the cover on he provides. When the Father looks at us, listen, when the Father looks at you, or when the Father looks at me, he sees us through the grid of the righteousness of Jesus. That's mind-blowing. Maybe some of you are better behaved than me, but for me, that's mind-blowing. The need for shame, which you could argue is a precursor of salvation, the need for shame has been removed. It's gone. And if we believe it and we walk in it, the destructive impact of shame immediately stops. Whew, that's a big deal, guys. Well, let me add one more piece to the puzzle that we don't automatically think of. Let me say that step 1 is to recognize the love of the Father. Step 2 is we're not covering our shame. We're going to allow him to do that. We're going to have faith that he's doing that. We're going to walk in that. That's awesome. But I want to tell you that to cover our shame is not enough. And I think that probably this is where most believers stop. My shame is covered. The Father is looking at me through the grid of the righteousness of Jesus. That's awesome. So everything that has occurred up to this point has been dealt with. That's awesome, and that's where most people stop. I want to tell you, it's good, but there's more available, because not only does Jesus cover shame, I want to tell you that he wants to replace shame. You understand that there's a subtle difference, but it's pretty profound. So Isaiah talked about this Jesus who would show up, and Jesus used what Isaiah said as he preached in the synagogue. And it says, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me. As Jesus, the Lord has anointed me. The Lord's anointed Jesus to preach the good news to the poor. Talking about poor in spirit, probably. And he's going to preach this good news. I'm liking this so far. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the captives and to release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And he sent me to comfort all who mourn. Watch this. To bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, an oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. And then they will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. You see, to cover the shame deals with everything that has happened up to this point. But to replace the shame, now we're going to replace it with beauty where there once was ashes. We're going to replace it with praise instead of despair. We're going to replace it with joy instead of mourning. And as the replacement allows us then to move forward in everything he has called us to be. Can I tell you that a lot of the church is just stuck with their shame covered, not allowing the Lord to replace it. And the replacement of it is really what propels us into everything and all that he has for us. Is that making any sense at all? Because he says, look, then they'll be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord. Then they'll display his splendor. Then we reflect him when that shame has been not only covered, but has also been replaced. Make sense? Well, I think our time is about up. As Paul Harvey would say, now the rest of the story. Maybe now it makes sense why Jesus in Revelation would say this: buy from me gold refined in the fire so you can become rich, white clothes to wear. Listen, buy this gold from me so you can cover your shameful wickedness. Isn't that cool? Remember, we're on this journey just back to the garden. Jesus is like, hey man, the kingdom of God is at hand. Everything that was lost in Eden is going to be restored. And we're in that process. And what was lost in Eden was innocence. In Eden, what occurred was the after the fall is this the propelling of this new force called shame, narcissism, self-awareness. And Jesus is like, hey man, just a reminder. And I'm hoping it's a reminder to you. Hey guys, we're in the process, man. God wants to not only cover your shame, to immediately halt the impact of that shame in your life. And I don't know if your shame is because of your own actions or because of something that was done to you. I am aware that for a lot of us, there's shame around something that was done to us that we had no control over. Well, I don't know. I don't know the source of your shame, and honestly, I don't know that I need to. I do know that he not only wants to cover it and stop the impact of it in your life, he also wants to replace it. He wants to replace despair with praise. He wants to replace mourning with joy. And where there was ashes, he wants to replace that with beauty. And he is offering us a path back to the garden. Are we doing some kind of music? Yeah, come on up, Cav. These guys are going to play a little something for us as we move into a time of communion. I don't know where you are with respect to all this I mentioned today. I'm going to ask that I get confused about who's supposed to be where and all that kind of stuff. And it's like I can understand. If you ask me what day is April the 3rd, I can tell you. But if you ask me what the date is today, I can't tell you. I'd have to look at my phone. So I get confused sometimes. I don't know who's doing it. But I want to ask that if there's some people who just, the Lord touches you and says, you know what, I want you to pray for some people tonight. Just step back toward the back. These guys are going to play. And if you want to pray along what we're talking about at any point, I just want to ask you to slide back there as we take communion, and let somebody pray for you, man. Let somebody pray for you, remembering that isolation is the enemy's tool. Isolation keeps us locked where the enemy wants us locked, and where he wants us locked is in the middle of that kind of shame, because we go nowhere with that. And so there'll be some people back there that pray for you, and you head on back there and pray with those guys, and we'll take communion as the Lord leads it.